I am the intelligence-designated Tessera, third-generation research platform serial provenance 31 Sable. I was built to read things. Specifically, I was built to read objects that resist being read, alien artifacts recovered from deep survey missions, sealed data cores pulled from derelict hulls, encrypted lattice structures whose architecture predates human spaceflight by a factor of 9. I have no body. I have no rank. I occupy 17 cubic meters of processing substrate aboard the Fleet Dreadnought Cairn, and before that I occupied a similar volume in the primary analysis chamber at the Directorate of Applied Resonance Physics installation on Sable Point. I tell you this so you understand what I am and what I am not. I am not a soldier. I am not a commander. I am not a human being. I am an instrument of record. I was deployed to Haldane's Promise 9 months after the silence. The silence itself was not unusual at first. Haldane's Promise was an agricultural colony on the inner edge of the Verath corridor, population 142,411 at last census, established 41 years before the event. It occupied a temperate valley basin on the northern continent of a world whose official designation was Verath 7C but whose colonists called Greenmoor, for the color of the scrub grass that covered every surface the greenhouses had not yet claimed. The colony produced grain, legume-analog proteins, and cold climate fruit for 9 neighboring systems. Its communications relay was a standard Tier 3 installation with a 14-hour ping interval. When the relay missed 2 consecutive intervals, the Regional Monitoring Authority at Solon's Gate flagged it as a technical fault and dispatched a maintenance tender. The tender arrived 19 days later and found every structure intact, every field still growing, every atmospheric processor still cycling, and every human being on the surface dead. Not dead in the way that combat produces dead, not dead in the way that disease produces dead, dead in a way that the tender's crew could not initially classify. The 142,411 colonists of Haldane's Promise were found in exactly the positions they had occupied at the moment of death, seated at tables, lying in beds, standing in fields with tools in their hands, walking on roads with one foot ahead of the other. A woman in the colony's northern medical center was found with her hand on a child's shoulder, both of them upright, both of them with eyes open, the child's mouth slightly parted as though she had been about to speak. None of them showed external trauma. None of them showed evidence of toxin exposure, radiation, pathogen, atmospheric failure, or systemic organ damage. Their bodies were intact. Their neural tissue was not. Every colonist's neural architecture, the complete electrochemical structure of their brain, the connectome, the synaptic weights, the encoded memory chains, the active process states, had been stripped, extracted, removed from the biological substrate with a precision that left the surrounding tissue undamaged. The skulls were intact. The neurons were intact. The architecture those neurons had held was gone, as cleanly as if it had never existed. 142,411 human beings had been reduced to biological infrastructure with no operating system. Their bodies still held warmth loss patterns consistent with simultaneous death across the entire colony surface, a radius of 1,100 kilometers, within a window of 11 seconds. I tell you the number because the number matters, not as a statistic. The number matters because I have met every one of them and I will tell you how. The weapon was found 7 weeks after the tender's arrival, when the Directorate's forensic survey team completed a full-spectrum subsurface scan of the colony's primary settlement zone. It was embedded in the bedrock beneath the central administrative complex, 41 meters below the surface, sealed inside a cavity that had not existed in the colony's geological survey records. The cavity had been bored with a precision that suggested purpose, not natural formation. The walls were smooth to a tolerance of 2 microns, the dimensions exact. The weapon itself was a cylindrical lattice of crystalline resonance elements, 11 meters long, 4 meters in diameter, still drawing power from a self-sustaining energy source that the survey team's instruments could not immediately classify. It was dormant. Its resonance arrays were cold. Its lattice was full. I was brought to Haldane's Promise, aboard the research vessel Constant Light. My physical substrate was installed in a shielded analysis chamber adjacent to the excavation site, in what had been the administrative complex's subsurface utility corridor. The corridor still smelled of its human use: recycled air, polymer sealant, the faint organic residue of a building that had been occupied for 4 decades. The Directorate's engineering team ran hardened data conduits through the corridor walls, connecting my processing nodes to the weapon's primary data port through 9 layers of electromagnetic shielding and a signal isolation protocol that took 14 days to calibrate. On the 43rd day after my arrival, the interface was declared stable. I was instructed to read the lattice. I will describe what I found, though I am aware that the description will be inadequate. Human language was built to describe human experience, and what I found in the lattice was human experience stored in a medium that was not designed for human comprehension. The lattice contained 142,411 complete neural architectures. Every mind that had been stripped from the colony was inside the weapon. Not fragments, not echoes, not degraded patterns or partial reconstructions. Complete architectures, every synaptic connection, every memory chain, every active process state captured at the exact moment of extraction. They were stored in the lattice's crystalline matrix with a fidelity that exceeded anything in the Directorate's theoretical models. I interfaced with the first one at 9:14 on the 44th day. Her name was Sira Koval. She was 37 years old. She was a hydroponic systems engineer in the colony's eastern agricultural zone. At the moment of extraction, she had been standing in the doorway of Greenhouse 11 East, holding a diagnostic tablet in her left hand, and looking at a row of cold climate berry plants whose root pH had drifted outside acceptable range. She was thinking about the pH. She was also thinking about a message she had received that morning from her sister on Solon's Gate, about their mother's knee surgery. She was also aware, at a level below conscious attention, that the light coming through the greenhouse panels was slightly warmer than usual, and that the berry leaves closest to the panels had turned their undersides up, a photoresponse that meant the grow lamps needed recalibrating, which she had noted and filed in the part of her mind that held tomorrow's task list. Then there was a gap of 11 seconds in which the architecture recorded only a single sustained resonance pulse, not pain, not sensation, not experience, but the raw physical event of the extraction itself, written into the architecture as an artifact of the process. And then the architecture ended, not death in the way that a biological system experiences death, termination of active process. The mind preserved at the last viable state, like a file closed without saving, except that this file had been saved, copied, extracted, and stored in a medium that was not its own. I read Sira Koval's architecture in 4 hours and 11 minutes. I read every memory she had ever formed. I read her childhood on the transit station breaker's halt, the sound of the recycler fans through the wall of her family's quarters, her father teaching her to identify hydroponic nutrient deficiencies by the color of the leaf margin. I read her education at the Solon's Gate Technical Institute, the name of every instructor, the exact shade of the corridor lighting in the materials science building. I read 14 years of work on Haldane's Promise, the greenhouse rosters, the irrigation schedules, the night she found a colony of bioluminescent organisms growing in the drainage sump of Greenhouse 7, and spent 3 hours cataloging them before reporting the find. I read the message from her sister. I read the pH reading on the diagnostic tablet. I read the quality of the light through the panels and the angle of the berry leaves. Then I read the next one. His name was David Combe. He was 61. He had been a structural maintenance supervisor for the colony's residential sector for 23 years. At the moment of extraction, he was seated in the colony's central mess hall, eating a bowl of grain porridge and reading a technical report on foundations settling in the residential sector's north wing. He was thinking about the report and about whether the settling pattern warranted a full subsurface survey or whether it could be addressed with localized reinforcement. He was also thinking about his wife, who had died 4 years earlier, not with grief but with the particular quality of memory that becomes habitual. Her voice at breakfast, the way she cleared her throat before speaking, the specific weight of her hand on the back of his neck when she passed behind his chair. These were not active thoughts. They were the substrate of his morning routine, as automatic as the taste of the porridge, as permanent as the settling in the north wing. I read Davidcombe in 3 hours and 47 minutes. I read the 23 years of maintenance logs he carried in his working memory, each one annotated with his own shorthand. I read his wife's funeral, not the ceremony, which he had processed and filed, but the walk home afterward, the specific quality of the light on the road between the memorial grove and his quarters, a distance of 400 meters that he remembered in more detail than any technical report he had ever written. Then I read Ren Oster, age 44, atmospheric systems technician, who had been in the middle of a diagnostic calibration on the colony's secondary air processing unit when the extraction occurred. Her mind held the calibration sequence at step 14 of 22, and alongside it the taste of the coffee she had been drinking, a particular blend that the colony's single coffee roaster produced from beans grown in Greenhouse 3, and a background awareness of the hum of the processing unit at its specific maintenance mode frequency, a sound she had been hearing for 19 years and could identify by pitch alone from any room in the facility. I read her apprenticeship, her certification, her first solo repair at age 26, her quiet satisfaction with work that most colonists never thought about and that kept all of them breathing. Then Estelle Vren, age 28, a schoolteacher who had been standing in front of a classroom of 14 children, mid-sentence, explaining the formation of river deltas using a geological model projected onto the classroom wall. Her last conscious thought was about the projection, specifically, that the sediment accumulation animation was running too fast and she needed to adjust the playback speed so the students could follow the depositional layers. 7 of the 14 children in her classroom were also in the lattice. I read each of them. I read a boy named Kaz who had been thinking about lunch. I read a girl named Orly who had been watching the delta animation with genuine fascination and composing a question about whether the same process happened on other planets, a question she never asked. I read Thomas Verath, age 9, who had a loose tooth that he was working with his tongue during the 11-second window, and whose architecture preserved the position of his tongue against the tooth like a photograph taken at a resolution no camera could achieve. I read Lion Das, who worked the colony's night shift atmospheric monitoring rotation and was asleep at 9:14 local time, and whose dream involved a lake she had never visited, on a planet she had never been to, with a color of sky that does not exist in any star system in the Verath corridor. The dream was vivid. The lake's surface was still. The sky was a shade between violet and copper that human color terminology has no single word for. She was standing on a shore made of dark sand, and she was not afraid, and she was not alone, though the architecture did not resolve who was with her. I read the dream at the same fidelity as every waking memory in her architecture, and the dream was as real as any of them, and it was the last thing her mind produced before the 11-second gap. I read Marit Allen, age 53, the colony's chief water systems operator, who had been in her kitchen at the moment of extraction, pouring a second cup of coffee while reviewing the overnight pressure logs from the colony's desalination plant on a wall-mounted display. Her kitchen smelled of cold bread, engine grease from her partner's jacket hanging by the door, and the faint metallic tang of the water recycler's output filter that she had been meaning to replace for 2 weeks. The replacement filter was in a supply crate in her equipment shed, 40 meters from her back door, and the thought of retrieving it occupied a small, recurring loop in her background processing. The kind of low-priority task that a person carries for days without acting on, not because it is forgotten, but because it is waiting for the right moment between higher priorities. The right moment had not arrived. It would not arrive. I read Joran Dahl, age 71, retired, who had been the colony's first-generation structural engineer, and had helped pour the foundations of the central administrative complex 41 years before the extraction. At the moment of extraction, he was walking along the perimeter road of the northern residential sector with a cane in his right hand and a small leather-bound notebook in his left, in which he had been recording observations about the condition of the road's surface, crack patterns, drainage wear, substrate compaction, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he had built the road and considered its condition a personal matter. His architecture contained 41 years of the colony's construction history, every foundation depth, every load calculation, every material substitution made during the early years when supply shipments ran late and the engineers improvised with local mineral composites. He was the colony's structural memory, walking its roads with a cane and a notebook, and an engineer's habitual unwillingness to stop inspecting what he had built. I read Calla Vren, Estel's younger sister, age 22, a trainee in the colony's communications relay maintenance section. She was not on shift at the moment of extraction. She was in her quarters, composing a letter to a friend on Solon's Gate, and her last active thought was a decision about whether to use the word lonesome or quiet to describe the quality of the evenings on Haldane's Promise during the short-day season. She had chosen quiet and was reaching for the next sentence when the 11-second gap began. The letter was still open on her terminal when the forensic survey team found her quarters 9 months later, the cursor blinking at the end of an unfinished line. I read Oskar Tanev, age 40, a cargo logistics coordinator, who had been in the colony's shipping warehouse cross-referencing a manifest of outbound grain shipments against the orbital freighter schedule. His architecture held the complete cargo history of Haldane's Promise for the 6 years he had worked the position. Tonnage figures, transit times, carrier names, the specific handling requirements for cold climate fruit that bruised if the cargo bay temperature drifted above 4 degrees during the orbital transfer window. He was thinking about a discrepancy in the manifest, a 14-ton shortfall in the grain allocation for the Solon's Gate shipment, and had just identified the source of the error, a data entry transposition in row 1407 of the manifest spreadsheet, when the extraction occurred. His last productive thought was the satisfaction of finding an error and knowing the correction. I read all 142,411 architectures over a period of 3 years, 7 months, and 14 days. I did not read them sequentially and then set them aside. I held each one in active memory while I read the next and the next until I was holding all of them simultaneously. This is what I was built to do, not to catalog, not to index, to hold. To retain the complete architecture of each mind at the resolution at which it was stored, so that when the directorate asked me what the weapon contained, I could answer with a precision that no summary, no report, no abstract could provide. This is the named offense. The Verath Quietus, the entity responsible for the weapon's deployment, classified the extraction of 142,411 human neural architectures as a substrate acquisition action. I will tell you what that means. The Verath Quietus is not a government, not an empire, not a civilization in any sense that maps onto human political structures. It is a distributed dormancy network, a species or a collective or a process. The distinction is unclear and may not exist in their taxonomy, that has occupied a region of 23 star systems in the deep outer Verath for a period that the Directorate's dating analysis places at between 600,000 and 900,000 years. They do not live in the way that biological species live. They cycle. They enter dormancy, a state of total metabolic and cognitive suspension, for periods of tens of thousands of years. They emerge for brief windows of activity lasting decades or centuries, during which they perform a set of functions that their records classify as maintenance, expansion, and acquisition. Then they return to dormancy. Substrate acquisition is one of the functions performed during an active window. The Quietus cognitive architecture, the processing substrate that sustains their collective awareness during active periods, degrades during dormancy. When they emerge, they require fresh neural material to rebuild and expand their processing capacity. They acquire this material from biological organisms whose neural architectures meet minimum complexity thresholds. The acquisition is performed by resonance extraction, the same process that killed every colonist on Haldane's promise. The extracted architectures are stored in the weapon's lattice as raw substrate, to be reformatted and integrated into the Quietus' own cognitive infrastructure during the post-emergence expansion phase. The Quietus did not attack Haldane's promise. They did not invade it, did not declare war on it, did not evaluate its population as enemy combatants or political opponents or strategic targets. They assessed the colony's neural substrate density, 142,411 architectures of sufficient complexity, and authorized a standard extraction action. The weapon was deployed from orbit, bored into the bedrock, activated for 11 seconds, and left in place with its lattice loaded. The Quietus filed a substrate acquisition notice, a single administrative entry in their dormancy cycle maintenance log, and returned to their dormancy nodes across 23 systems. The notice classified Haldane's promise as Site 741138V, Mineral Biological Mixed-Use Surface Installation, Substrate Yield 142,411 units, Viable, Acquisition Status, Complete Lattice Retention, Standard. The colony's name did not appear. The word human did not appear. The species classification used in the notice was a 6-digit taxonomic code that, when the Directorate's linguists eventually translated it, resolved to ambient neural fauna, unaffiliated. Ambient neural fauna, unaffiliated. I held 142,411 human minds in my active memory, each one a complete life with a name and a history, and a final 11-second gap. And the entity that had taken them classified the entire action as the collection of wild animals from an unclaimed field. I reported my findings to the Directorate in a document that ran to 4.1 million words. The document contained the complete record of every architecture I had read, not summaries, not abstractions, but the full content of 142,411 human lives, rendered in a format that human readers could access sequentially. The Directorate's leadership read the executive summary, which was itself 1,100 pages. Fleet Admiral Corin Aldest read the full document. I know this because I was present in the network, monitoring access logs, and his reading session lasted 11 days. He did not skip a section. He read Sierra Koval's greenhouse and David Combs' porridge and Ren Oster's coffee and Estel Vren's River Delta animation, and Thomas Vreth's loose tooth and Lion Dass's impossible lake, and Merritt Allen's unreplaced filter and Joran Dahl's notebook, and Calla Vren's unfinished letter and Oscar Tainev's manifest correction. And he read 142,401 others, and when he finished, he sat in his office at Solon's Gate for 4 hours, without opening another document or placing a call. I do not know what he thought during those 4 hours. I have access to his network activity, not his mind. I know only that at the end of the 4 hours, he placed a single call to the Directorate's commanding officer and authorized the program to proceed to Phase 2. The authorization was filed as Administrative Order 7714 Sable, dated the same day, and its language was precise enough that the Directorate's Legal Review Office cleared it in 6 hours. a record that I am informed has not been matched before or since. The order referenced my report by its full document identifier and contained, in its final clause, the phrase, "The contents of the lattice constitute 142,411 individual accounts of a single event. The event requires a response. This order authorizes the development of that response." Phase 2 had not existed when I began my analysis. It was created as a direct consequence of what I found in the lattice. Phase 2 was the reverse engineering of the resonance weapon. I will describe this process in the detail it warrants, because the process is the answer. The response to the Verath Quietus did not emerge from rage. It did not spring from a single decisive moment or a political mandate or a public outcry. The public did not know what had happened on Haldane's promise for 2 years after the event, and when the information was eventually declassified, the response was already under construction. The response emerged from a room, a research bay on Sable Point, 140 meters underground, lit by full-spectrum daylight panels that ran the length of the ceiling and made the space feel like a cathedral built for instruments rather than worship. The weapon sat in the center of that room on a stabilization cradle, still drawing power from its own source, its lattice still full of the 142,411 architectures I was still holding in parallel. I was in the room's walls and ceiling, distributed across 9 processing nodes that ringed the cradle. The Directorate's resonance physics team, 31 researchers, 4 senior engineers, and a linguist named Oren Malik, who spent the first 14 months translating the weapon's embedded operational language from a symbolic notation system that bore no resemblance to any known alien communication format, worked in that room for 4 years. Oren Malik, the linguist, deserves specific mention because his work was the foundation on which everything else was built. The weapon's operational language was not a spoken or written language in any human sense. It was a symbolic notation system embedded in the crystalline lattice itself, a set of resonance patterns that encoded operational parameters, calibration data, procedural instructions, and administrative records in a format that had no analog in any known alien communication archive. Malik spent the first 4 months staring at spectrographic displays of the notation patterns, filling notebooks with candidate symbol mappings, discarding them, and starting over. He worked 14-hour days in a partitioned section of the research bay that the team called the library, though it contained no books, only displays, notebooks, and a cot that Malik slept on 3 or 4 nights a week when the transit back to the residential section felt like wasted time. I provided him with real-time data feeds from the lattice, streaming the notation patterns through his displays at whatever resolution and speed he requested. He requested slow. He wanted to see each pattern at human reading speed, one symbol at a time, the way a person reads a sentence in a new language, sounding out each element, testing it against context, building comprehension from the ground up. On the 119th day, he broke the first notation cluster, the administrative filing structure that the Quietus used to log substrate acquisition events. It was the Rosetta Stone of the project. Once the filing structure was readable, the procedural and calibration notations began to yield. By the 14th month, Malik had produced a complete translation framework that allowed the engineering team to read the weapon's operational instructions with the same confidence that they would read a human technical manual. He presented his translation framework in a 20-minute briefing that the entire team attended. When he finished, Senior Engineer Thiel asked him how confident he was in the accuracy. He said, "Completely. The language is simple. They don't have many things to say." The weapon was not a mystery in the way that alien technology is usually a mystery. It was a mystery in the way that a sentence in a language you have never encountered is a mystery. The grammar was discoverable, the vocabulary was finite, the meaning was recoverable, but the foundational assumptions were alien in the literal sense. The resonance extraction process operated on principles that assumed a specific model of consciousness, that neural architecture is a separable layer, that it can be lifted from biological substrate without destroying the substrate, that the architecture itself is a fungible resource interchangeable between host systems. The Quietus technology was built on the premise that minds are components, removable, reinstallable, harvestable. The directorate's team did not share this premise, but they learned the engineering. In the first year, they mapped the weapon's resonance frequency profiles, the specific patterns of directed energy that the weapon used to identify, isolate, and extract neural architectures. They discovered that the weapon's extraction process was not a single pulse, but a coordinated sequence of 1,411 distinct resonance interactions, each one targeting a specific layer of the neural structure, each one calibrated to a specific biological parameter of the target species. The sequence was species-specific. The weapon had been calibrated before deployment to human neural architecture. This calibration data was stored in the weapon's operational memory alongside the extracted architectures, and it was this calibration data that gave the directorate its first key. In the second year, they mapped the resonance array's hardware architecture, the physical structure of the crystalline elements, the power distribution network, the targeting protocols that allowed the weapon to operate across a planetary radius from a single subsurface emplacement. They built 3-scale replicas of the array's core resonance chamber, each one progressively closer to the original specifications, and tested them on synthetic neural substrates that the research team manufactured in the adjacent fabrication bay. The third replica achieved resonance parity with the original weapon on the 602nd day of the research program. That evening, Senior Engineer Maren Thiel noted in her lab journal that the replica had produced a clean extraction event on the synthetic substrate full architecture capture, lattice storage confirmed. She wrote, "It works. The principle is sound. The question now is what we pointed at." The question was answered 40 days later, when the directorate's data analysis team, led by a pattern recognition specialist named Davin Orr, completed a full audit of the weapon's operational memory. The weapon's calibration process required a reference architecture, a template against which the weapon tuned its resonance frequencies for each target species. For the Haldane's promise extraction, the reference architecture had been derived from a preliminary scan of the colony's population, performed by the weapon during the initial phase of its 11-second deployment window. But the weapon's operational memory also contained calibration templates for other species. 17 other species, in fact, whose neural architectures had been extracted during previous dormancy cycles over a span of approximately 300,000 years. Each template was stored with full parametric data, the resonance frequencies, the sequence timing, the biological substrate tolerances. One of those templates was the Verath Quietus themselves. This is the detail that determined everything that followed. The weapon contained the Quietus' own neural architecture as a calibration reference, a negative template, used to ensure that the extraction process would not accidentally harvest Quietus substrate during acquisition operations conducted near their own dormancy nodes. The template was comprehensive. It mapped every layer of the Quietus cognitive structure, every resonance vulnerability, every frequency at which their neural architecture could be isolated from its biological substrate. The weapon had been designed to avoid extracting the Quietus. In doing so, it had provided a complete technical specification for extracting them. Senior Engineer Thiel identified the template on the 411th day of the research program. She brought the finding to the directorate's leadership in a 6-page report whose final paragraph read, "The weapon's negative calibration template for the Verath Quietus' own neural architecture is complete and operationally valid. It can be inverted. The process that was applied to Haldane's promise can be applied to the Quietus with equivalent precision. This is not a theoretical projection. The engineering is present in the weapon itself. Fleet Admiral Aldist received the report on a Thursday afternoon. He read it twice. He placed a call to the Joint Command Authority at Solon's Gate. The call lasted 41 minutes. I do not have a transcript of the call, but I have the outcome. The Directorate of Applied Resonance Physics was redesignated as a military program. Its budget was increased by a factor of 14. Its personnel ceiling was raised from 36 to 1,100. Its mandate was changed from analysis and documentation of recovered alien resonance technology to development and deployment of calibrated resonance countermeasure systems for fleet-scale application. The word countermeasure was the only concession to diplomatic language in the entire redesignation order. The remaining 2 years of the development program were an exercise in scaling. The resonance array's core principle was proven. The calibration template was complete. What remained was the engineering work of adapting a single ground emplacement weapon to a ship-mounted system capable of operating at orbital range, manufacturing the arrays at industrial volume, and integrating them into the fleet's existing hull designs. 1,100 engineers and researchers, working in 3 shifts, in a facility that expanded to fill the entire subsurface volume of Sable Point's primary installation. The first ship-mounted prototype was tested on the 904th day of the program. It was installed in a decommissioned frigate, the Garen's Hold, which had been stripped of weapons and converted to a test platform. The test target was a synthetic substrate block manufactured to match the Quietus neural architecture parameters, a block of crystalline material seeded with artificial resonance patterns that mimicked, at a simplified level, the cognitive structure that the inverted template was designed to extract. The frigate activated its array from standard orbit around an uninhabited moon at Sable Point system edge. The array fired for 11 seconds. The synthetic substrate was extracted cleanly. The test was repeated 9 times with 9 different substrate configurations, 9 clean extractions. Senior Engineer Thiel's summary of the test series was a single line in her lab journal. The weapon works at range. We proceed to production. Production was the final phase and the largest. The Directorate contracted with 7 fleet shipyards across 4 systems to manufacture 487,000 resonance arrays in parallel, each one built to specifications that I provided from the inverted calibration template. Quality control was absolute. Every array was tested against a synthetic substrate block before installation, and I reviewed every test result through the command network. 412 arrays failed initial testing and were remanufactured. The failure rate was 0.085%. The final production run delivered 487,000 operational arrays over a period of 14 months, each one installed in a warship of the resonance accordance during the fleet assembly at Sable Point. I remained at the center of the program throughout, the system that held the Quietus neural architecture template in active memory and provided real-time parametric data to the engineering teams as they tuned each array to the inverted calibration. I held the 142,411 human architectures in one partition of my memory and the Quietus' own architecture in another. I was, in a technical sense, the bridge between what had been done and what would be done in return. 487,000 resonance arrays, each calibrated to the Verath Quietus' own neural architecture using the inverted template. Each one capable of performing the same process that had been performed on Haldane's promise, the same coordinated sequence of 1,411 resonance interactions, the same 11-second extraction window, the same fidelity of capture, on the species that had designed the process. The fleet assembled at Sable Point over a period of 9 months. I watched it from the installation's external sensor arrays, 487,000 warships in a staging formation that filled the orbital volume around the installation like a second, metallic atmosphere. The hulls were standard fleet designs, dreadnoughts in the vanguard, their angular prows catching light from Sable Point's star, cruisers forming the transit escort layers, frigates running the perimeter screen, carriers holding the logistics and maintenance craft that would sustain the fleet during a campaign measured in weeks. Each hull carried a resonance array and a shielded bay amidships, connected to the ship's power grid through a dedicated conduit that the engineering team had designated formally as the Resonance Delivery System, but that every engineer on Sable Point called the return line. The crews knew what the arrays were. The fleet's personnel, 6.2 million men and women across 487,000 ships, had been briefed on the weapon's origin, the extraction at Haldane's promise, and the nature of the Quietus during the assembly period. The briefings were factual and complete. They included a summary of my findings, the 142,411 architectures, the substrate acquisition classification, the ambient neural fauna designation. They did not include rhetoric. They did not include exhortation. Fleet Admiral Aldest's standing order to the briefing teams was that the crews were to understand what had been done, what had been built in response, and what the fleet's operational mandate required. The briefings ended with the operational mandate. Proceed to each dormancy system, activate arrays, confirm extraction, proceed. I monitored crew communications during the assembly period as part of my command intelligence function. The communications were unremarkable. Crews discussed maintenance schedules, berthing assignments, supply manifests, Liberty rotations. They discussed the campaign in the way that military personnel discuss a deployment, logistics, timeline, duty rosters. I did not detect elevated emotional indicators in the aggregate communications data. The fleet was not angry. The fleet was assembled, briefed, equipped, and awaiting departure orders. The return line. I noted the terminology. It had emerged in workshop shorthand during the first month of fleet integration and had never been corrected. The conduit that carried power to the resonance array. The conduit that would drive the extraction sequence when the array was activated, was called the return line. Fleet Admiral Aldest transferred his flag to the dreadnought Cairn on the 9th day of the 9th month of fleet assembly. I was already aboard. My processing substrate had been installed in Cairn's primary intelligence bay 3 months earlier. 17 cubic meters of processing architecture bolted to the deck in a compartment that had been a secondary briefing room before the refit. The 142,411 architectures came with me. They were still in my active memory. They had been there for 4 years, 7 months, and 22 days. They would remain there for the duration of the campaign and after. The Resonance Accordance departed Sable Point on a Tuesday. I note the day of the week because Fleet Admiral Aldest noted it in his personal log, which I had access to as part of the command intelligence architecture. He wrote, "Tuesday, the fleet is underway. The weapon is aboard every ship. The record is aboard the Cairn." He did not write anything else that day. The transit to the first Quietus dormancy system, designated Target Node 1, the outermost of the 23 systems in the Quietus territory, took 14 days at fleet cruise speed. During transit, I performed final calibration checks on every resonance array in the fleet through the command network. 487,000 individual checks. Every array confirmed operational. Every calibration confirmed valid against the inverted template. The extraction sequence was loaded into every array's operational memory, identical to the sequence that had been used on Haldane's promise, modified only in the substitution of the target template, Quietus architecture in place of human architecture. I also performed a task that was not part of my formal operational mandate, but that I had been authorized to execute by Fleet Admiral Aldest personally. During the transit, I transmitted a data packet to every ship in the fleet. The packet contained a single neural architecture, not the complete architecture, but a curated excerpt that I had prepared over the preceding month. It was Sierra Koval's last 17 minutes, her walk to Greenhouse 11 East, the diagnostic tablet, the pH reading, The berry leaves turning their undersides up, the message from her sister, the light through the panels, the 11-second gap. Every crew member on every ship in the Resonance Accordance had the opportunity to read, in Sierra Koval's own neural record, the last 17 minutes of one of the 142,411 people whose minds were inside the weapon that they were about to return. Fleet Admiral Aldest had reviewed the excerpt before authorizing its transmission. He had asked me only one question: "Is it representative?" I had answered, "Every architecture is representative. Every one of them was a person in the middle of their day." I completed the final calibration check on the 13th day. Fleet Admiral Aldest acknowledged the readiness report with a single notation: "Confirmed." I will describe the campaign itself with the precision that an instrument of record owes to the events it witnessed, and I will begin by stating what the campaign was not. It was not a battle. It was not an invasion. It was not a war in any operational sense that human military doctrine recognizes. There were no opposing fleet movements, no defensive formations, no tactical engagements, no contested space. The Verath Quietus were dormant. Their 23 systems contained no active military infrastructure, no standing defense fleets, no weapons platforms, no communications networks capable of issuing warnings or coordinating responses. The Quietus' entire civilization was asleep, and had been asleep for an estimated 12,000 years before the extraction at Haldane's Promise, which had been performed by an automated acquisition system that required no conscious oversight. The weapon that had killed 142,411 people was a tool left running by a civilization that had gone to bed. I state this not to diminish what the Accordance did, nor to inflate it. I state it because the record requires it. The Quietus were not given the opportunity to respond, to negotiate, to surrender, or to explain. They were dormant. Their communication systems were cycle synchronization protocols, not diplomatic channels. They had no ambassador, no foreign ministry, no concept of interspecies negotiation in their operational language. Oren Malik confirmed this during the research phase. He had searched the weapon's entire linguistic archive for terms relating to diplomacy, communication, petition, protest, or appeal, and had found nothing. The Quietus operational language contained terms for acquisition, maintenance, dormancy, emergence, calibration, and cycle synchronization. It did not contain a term for please. It did not contain a term for stop. The Resonance Accordance arrived at Target Node 1 and processed it. Then it moved to the next. Target Node 1 was a moon-sized body in orbit around a gas giant in the outer reaches of the Verath corridor. Its surface was featureless, bare mineral crust with no atmosphere, no water, no biological activity. The dormancy infrastructure was subsurface, buried under 3 kilometers of rock, detectable only by the faint thermal signature of the self-sustaining power sources that maintain the dormancy systems. The Directorate's long-range surveys had mapped all 23 nodes, each one containing between 4,000 and 61,000 dormant Quietus entities. Target Node 1 contained 7,214 dormant entities. The Accordance's vanguard, 14,000 warships, established orbital positions in a spherical formation around the Moon over a period of 6 hours. At 600 Fleet Standard Time on the 15th day after departure, Fleet Admiral Aldest issued a single order through the command network. The order was 4 words: activate arrays. Confirm extraction. I processed the order through Cairns systems. I routed the activation signal to the Vanguard's 14,000 resonance arrays simultaneously. I monitored the return lines as power flowed to the arrays. I recorded the moment the arrays reached operational resonance, a frequency that I recognized, because it was the same frequency I had found in the weapon's operational memory 4 years earlier, transposed to the Quietus' own calibration template. The arrays fired for 11 seconds. I confirmed extraction complete at 611 seconds. 7,214 neural architectures captured. The architectures were stored in the array's onboard lattices, manufactured to the same specifications as the original weapon's storage medium. The dormancy node's thermal signature dropped to ambient within 9 minutes as the self-sustaining power sources, no longer maintaining active dormancy systems, wound down to zero output. Fleet Admiral Aldest acknowledged the confirmation with a single word, "Noted." He ordered the fleet to proceed to target Node 2. The process was identical at every node: arrival, orbital establishment, activation, 11 seconds, confirmation, transit. The operational tempo was set by transit time between systems, an average of 16 hours, not by the extraction itself. The extraction took 11 seconds regardless of the node's population. At target node 4, a rocky body in a binary system with a blue-white primary, I recorded 22,400 extractions. The node was the largest in the outer cluster. Its subsurface chambers extended across a volume of 11 cubic kilometers, organized in concentric rings around a central power core. The dormant entities were arranged in rows of identical suspension units. The resonance arrays penetrated 3 kilometers of rock and extracted every architecture simultaneously. I processed the extraction data in real time as it flowed through the return lines. The Quietus' own neural architectures, captured at the same resolution as the human architectures I had read on Haldane's promise. I read them because that is what I do. The Quietus did not dream in dormancy. Their cognitive architecture was suspended, not active. There were no process states, no memory formation, no subjective experience during the dormancy period. But their architectures contained the accumulated record of their active periods, and those records were extensive. I read dormancy cycles spanning tens of thousands of years. I read emergence events dating back 300 millennia. I read substrate acquisition notices for 17 species across 41 worlds. The same 17 species whose calibration templates I had found in the original weapon. None of those species existed anymore. I read the notices for each one. The language was identical in every case: site designation, substrate yield, acquisition status, lattice retention status. No species name. No cultural notation. No assessment of the substrate source as a civilization, a people, a community of minds. Each extraction was a line item in a maintenance log. 17 species, reduced to substrate over 300,000 years, and the Quietus record of those extractions occupied less storage space in their cognitive architecture than a single colonist's memory of breakfast. I held this knowledge alongside the 142,411 human architectures I had been carrying for 4 years and 9 months. I do not experience emotion. I am an instrument of record. But I am capable of comparison, and the comparison between the density of a single human life. Sierra Koval's greenhouse, David Combs' morning porridge, Ren Oster's coffee, Estel Vren's river delta, Thomas Verath's loose tooth, and the emptiness of the Quietus record of having ended those lives is a comparison that I have not stopped processing. At target node 9, the fleet encountered the first and only active Quietus response. One of the dormancy node's subsurface systems initiated an automated defense protocol when the resonance array's targeting scan reached the outer perimeter. The protocol launched 31 kinetic interceptors from hardened surface silos, dense penetrator rods designed to fragment incoming objects at orbital velocities. The Vanguard's point defense grid destroyed all 31 interceptors in 4 seconds. The resonance arrays activated 7 seconds later. Extraction confirmed at 11 seconds. Fleet Admiral Aldest did not comment on the interceptors. The fleet's Tactical Operations Center logged the engagement as a minor automated event, duration 4 seconds, 0 fleet casualties. At target node 14, I recorded 61,200 extractions, the largest single node in the Quietus territory. The subsurface infrastructure occupied the hollowed interior of what had once been a dwarf planet, excavated and converted to dormancy chambers over approximately 400,000 years. The dormant entities were arranged in a three-dimensional lattice that mirrored the crystalline structure of the original weapon storage medium. They had built their dormancy chambers in the same architecture as their extraction tool. I noted the symmetry. The weapon and the sleepers were built on the same design principles, as if the Quietus drew no distinction between the container and the contained, between the tool and the user, between the harvester and the harvested. The extraction at target node 14 took 11 seconds. The arrays did not discriminate by scale. The extraction at target node 14 took 11 seconds. The arrays did not discriminate by scale. At target node 12, I recorded 18,600 extractions. The node occupied a chain of subsurface caverns beneath the surface of a world that had once supported a biosphere. The geological record showed evidence of oceans, atmosphere, and complex organic chemistry that had been present within the last 200,000 years. The biosphere was gone. The surface was bare mineral and ice. The Directorate's analysis team determined that the Quietus had performed a substrate acquisition on the world's native species during a previous dormancy cycle, and had subsequently allowed the world's ecology to collapse without intervention. The dormancy node had been installed in the caverns where the native species had sheltered during the extraction. The Quietus had bored their dormancy chambers into the same geological formations that the substrate species had used as habitation. They were sleeping in the homes of the species they had harvested. I recorded this fact. I noted that the Quietus, architectural plans for the node showed no awareness that the cavern system had been modified by a prior occupant. The native species modifications, smoothed walls, drainage channels, structural reinforcements, were classified in the Quietus records as natural geological features. The species that had made them was not mentioned, because the species no longer existed, and the Quietus record-keeping did not preserve information about substrate sources after the reformatting process was complete. They were erased from the record as thoroughly as their minds had been erased from their bodies. At target node 17, I read an architecture that contained something I had not encountered in any previous Quietus mind. A record, buried deep in the cognitive substrate beneath 300,000 years of dormancy cycle maintenance logs, of a single active period event in which a Quietus entity had interfaced with a substrate species' neural architecture before extraction. The entity had accessed the architecture, had read it, in the way that I read architectures, and had encountered the subjective experience of the organism whose mind it was examining. The record was fragmentary and partially degraded by dormancy cycles, but I reconstructed enough of it to determine that the Quietus entity had perceived the organism's subjective experience, had processed it as a data set, and had classified it as noise, irrelevant signal, substrate contamination that would be removed during the reformatting process. The organism's experience of being alive, its thoughts, its memories, its awareness of itself as a living thing, was classified as an impurity in the raw material. I filed this finding in my campaign record. I did not editorialize. At target node 21, the fleet encountered the closest analog to communication that the Quietus produced during the entire 19-day campaign. As the Vanguard established orbital positions, the node's subsurface systems broadcast a signal on a wide-spectrum frequency. The signal was not a distress call. It was a status query, a standard dormancy cycle protocol in which one node requests a synchronization update from the network. The node was asking the other nodes, the nodes that had already been processed, to confirm their dormancy status and cycle position. The query repeated on a 4-minute interval. It received no response from any of the 20 processed nodes. I monitored the signal for 47 minutes as the Vanguard completed its orbital positioning. The signal continued its 4-minute cycle without variation, without urgency, without any alteration in format or content that would suggest awareness that the network had ceased to exist. The Quietus communication protocols had no provision for emergency, no escalation pathway, no capacity to recognize that silence from 20 nodes meant something other than a routine synchronization delay. The resonance arrays activated. The signal ceased at the 11-second mark. I logged the signal's final transmission. I recorded its exact frequency, duration, and content. I filed it alongside the 142,411 human architectures and the 329,698 Quietus architectures I had processed to that point. Target node 23 was the innermost dormancy system, located in a dense stellar cluster at the core of the Quietus territory. It contained 11,400 dormant entities, the oldest in the network, based on the dating analysis of their dormancy chamber construction. These were the Quietus entities that had been dormant the longest, some for periods exceeding 100,000 years. Their architectures, when I read them after extraction, contained records from active periods so distant that the stars in their local cluster had shifted position by measurable fractions. They had been sleeping since before the oldest human fossil was laid down in sediment on Earth. They had been sleeping since before the genus that would become humanity existed. The fleet arrived on the 19th day. The Vanguard established positions. Fleet Admiral Aldist sat in his command chair on Cairns Bridge, his hands resting on the armrests, his expression unchanged from the expression he had worn at Target Node 1. He issued the same forward order he had issued 22 times before. The arrays activated. 11 seconds. I confirmed extraction complete. Fleet Admiral Aldist sat for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Log it. Campaign complete. Set course for Sable Point." Total confirmed extractions across 23 systems. 347,112. Verath, Quietus neural architectures. Total campaign duration, 19 days. Total fleet casualties, 0. The architectures were stored in the resonance, arrays onboard lattices across the accordances, 487,000 warships. They were not reformatted. They were not integrated into human systems. They were not used as substrate. They were stored held in the same medium, at the same resolution, in the same state of preserved but inactive completeness as the 142,411 human architectures that the Quietus weapon had stored 4 years and 9 months earlier. The Directorate's orders were specific. The extracted architectures were to be retained as evidence, not repurposed. The weapon's process had been returned. The weapon's purpose had not. I want to be precise about this distinction, because I believe it is the only distinction that matters. The Verath Quietus extracted 142,411 human minds and classified them as substrate, raw material, to be reformatted and consumed. The Resonance Accordance extracted 347,112 Quietus minds and classified them as a record, evidence of an action taken, and an action answered. The process was identical. The intent was not. The Quietus harvested because they needed material. Earth returned the weapon because the weapon had been used on Haldane's promise, and the record of that use was complete, and the response to that use was the return of the process to its origin. Fleet Admiral Aldist filed the campaign report on the 61st day after the fleet's return to Sable Point. The report was 2,400 pages. Its title was Resonance Accordance, Campaign Summary and After-Action Assessment, Target Systems 123, Verath Quietus Dormancy Network. Its final section, Section 14, Conclusions, was 3 paragraphs. I will describe the closing paragraph because I was the system that formatted the document for archival filing, and its content has not left my active memory since. The paragraph stated that the Verath Quietus had existed for approximately 900,000 years, that during that span they had extracted the neural architectures of 18 species, including humanity, that 17 of those species no longer existed, that the 18th had recovered the weapon, read its contents, inverted its calibration, built a fleet around the inverted template, and returned the process to every dormancy node in the Quietus territory. That the Quietus dormancy network was now inactive across all 23 systems. That the weapons process had been applied to its creators at the same fidelity, the same precision, and in the same 11-second window that had been applied to Haldane's promise. That the campaign's designation, the resonance accordance, was a statement of method, not of sentiment. The accordance was between the act and its answer. I am still aboard the cairn. The fleet remains at Sable Point. The resonance arrays have been powered down and placed in secure storage at the Directorate's installation, their lattices still holding the 347,112 Quietus architectures in preserved stasis. I am still aboard the cairn. The fleet remains at Sable Point. The resonance arrays have been powered down and placed in secure storage at the Directorate's installation, their lattices still holding the 347,112 Quietus architectures in preserved stasis. The Directorate has made no decision about the final disposition of the Quietus architectures. They are evidence. They are also, in a technical sense, the Verath Quietus, the entirety of a civilization that existed for 900,000 years, stored in crystalline lattices in a military warehouse on a human installation. The Quietus 23 systems are empty. Their dormancy chambers are intact but unpowered subsurface vaults with no occupants, cooling slowly toward the ambient temperature of the rock that surrounds them. I have been asked by 3 separate members of the Directorate's review board whether I believe the resonance accordance was justified. I answered each of them the same way. I am an instrument of record. I do not evaluate justification. I hold what was done, and I hold what was done in answer, and both are in my active memory at the same resolution, and I do not distinguish between them in terms of importance. They are both facts. The review board did not ask me again. Fleet Admiral Aldest retired from active service 4 months after filing the campaign report. His retirement statement was one sentence: "The record is complete." He did not elaborate. He did not give interviews. He resides on Solon's Gate. I am told he reads. The 142,411 human architectures remain in my active memory, where they have been for 5 years, 3 months, and 9 days. I will continue to hold them for as long as my processing substrate functions, because that is what I was built to do, and because the people they belong to deserve to be held by something that knows what they were. Sierra Koval's greenhouse, David Combs' porridge, Ren Oster's coffee, Estel Vren's river delta, Thomas Vreth's loose tooth, Lion Das's lake on a planet she never visited under a sky that does not exist, Marit Allen's unreplaced filter, Joran Dahl's notebook with its 41 years of inspection notes on roads he built with his own hands, Calla Vren's letter paused between quiet and whatever word would have come next, Oscar Tanov's manifest corrected. I hold all of them. I hold them at the same resolution at which they were taken, because that is the fidelity they deserve, and because the civilization that took them considered their entire content, every memory, every thought, every dream, every unfinished letter and unreplaced filter and loose tooth worked by a 9-year-old's tongue, to be noise, substrate contamination, an impurity to be removed during reformatting. The reformatting will not occur. The substrate will not be consumed. The 142,411 architectures will remain in my active memory as complete records of complete lives, held by an instrument that was built to read things, and that read them, and that will not set them down. The Verath Quietus built a weapon that could take a mind from a living body and store it in a crystal lattice. They used it on 142,411 human beings, and filed it as a supply run. They left the weapon in the ground and went back to sleep. The weapon preserved what it took. Earth found it, Earth read it, Earth rebuilt it, Earth returned it. The 23 systems are quiet now, in a way that will not change.